Sometimes the most ordinary moments hold the power to completely change your life. What started as a simple Saturday morning task turned into something I never could have imagined. If you're someone who believes that the universe has a way of putting exactly the right people in your path at exactly the right moment, then this story is going to speak to your soul. Get comfortable, because what happened next will make you question everything you thought you knew about timing, courage, and second chances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah, and at 52, I thought I had my life figured out. After 30 years of teaching high school English in Riverside, Oregon, I'd finally retired with a decent pension, a paid-off house on Maple Street, and what I believed was a clear vision of my golden years. Quiet mornings with coffee and classic novels, tending to my neglected garden, maybe taking that painting class I'd been putting off for decades. The kind of peaceful existence that sounds perfect in theory, but feels hollow when you're living it alone. The morning everything changed started like any other Saturday in late October. The maple trees lining our street were putting on their final show, dropping leaves in brilliant shades of amber and crimson that crunched satisfyingly under my slippers as I retrieved the newspaper. Our neighborhood had that picture-perfect small-town charm that real estate agents love to highlight. White picket fences, wraparound porches, and the kind of neighbors who still wave when they drive past. It's the sort of place where everyone knows your business, but also the kind of place where someone will show up with casserole when you need it most. I'd been putting off cleaning my gutters for weeks, watching them fill with leaves while telling myself it could wait another day. But with the weather forecast calling for the first real storm of the season, I knew I couldn't procrastinate any longer. The two-story colonial I'd called home for 15 years suddenly felt overwhelming in its maintenance demands. When my ex-husband Brian lived here, these tasks had been his domain. Now, 3 years after our divorce, I was still learning to navigate the endless list of homeowner responsibilities that had somehow become mine alone. Standing in my driveway, coffee mug in hand, I stared up at the gutters with a mixture of determination and dread. The ladder in my garage seemed impossibly tall, and at 52, climbing up to the second story felt more daunting than it had even 5 years ago. I'd reached that age where you start calculating risks differently, where every decision comes with a mental assessment of potential consequences. But the practical side of me, the same side that had managed a classroom of teenagers for 3 decades, knew this job needed to be done. That's when I spotted the young man across the street loading equipment into a pickup truck. I'd seen him around the neighborhood a few times over the past month, usually working on the Pattersons' roof or fixing Mrs. Henderson's front steps. He looked to be in his late 20s, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from working, with your hands and the genuine smile of someone who actually enjoys helping people. There was something refreshingly straightforward about him, a quality that seemed increasingly rare in my world of complicated emotions and uncertain futures. I found myself walking across the street before I'd consciously decided to do so, my heart beating faster with each step. Approaching strangers had never been my strong suit. As a teacher, I'd been comfortable with authority and clear boundaries. But this felt different, vulnerable. I was asking for help, admitting I couldn't handle something on my own, and that admission felt heavier than it should have. Mike, as he introduced himself, had the kind of handshake that spoke of honest work and genuine character. His truck was organized with the precision of someone who took pride in his craft, tools arranged systematically, and a work schedule that spoke to his reliability. When I explained my gutter situation, his immediate response wasn't to quote me a price or schedule me for next week. Instead, he glanced up at my house, then back at me with a smile that put me instantly at ease. "I've got about an hour before my next appointment," he said, already reaching for his ladder. "Let's take a look at what we're dealing with." There was something magical about watching someone work who genuinely loved what they did. Mike moved with the fluid efficiency of experience, setting up his ladder with practiced ease and climbing up to assess the situation. From the ground, I found myself studying his careful movements, the way he tested each rung before putting his full weight on it, the methodical approach he took to examining the gutters. It reminded me of the way I used to approach lesson planning, breaking down complex tasks into manageable steps. "These are definitely ready for cleaning," he called down, his voice carrying just the right mix of professionalism and warmth. "Lots of leaves and some debris, but nothing too complicated. The good news is, your gutters are in great shape otherwise. Someone took good care of this house." That someone had been Brian, though I didn't mention it. Instead, I watched Mike work, marveling at how he managed to make something I'd been dreading look almost effortless. He moved along the gutter line with steady confidence, clearing away months of accumulated leaves and checking for any signs of damage or wear. Occasionally, he'd point out something interesting, a bird's nest that had been tucked into a corner or a particularly stubborn section where debris had packed down hard. As he worked, we talked about the neighborhood, the changing seasons, the quirks of older houses. There was an easiness to our conversation that surprised me, the kind of natural flow that usually took months to develop with new people. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mike had opinions about everything from the best coffee shops in Riverside to the way the town council was handling the new development proposals, and he shared them with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely cared about his community. About halfway through the job, Carol from next door appeared on her front porch with the timing of someone who'd been watching from her window. Carol was one of those neighbors who managed to know everything happening within a 3-block radius while somehow always seeming surprised by the information she shared. She was protective and nosy in equal measure, traits that had served our neighborhood well over the years, but sometimes felt suffocating when you were trying to have a private moment. "Sarah, honey," she called across the yard, "is everything all right?" I saw the ladder and got worried. Her eyes moved from me to Mike and back again with the sharp assessment of someone cataloging details for future reference. "Just getting the gutters cleaned before the storm," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. Mike here was kind enough to help out. Carol's expression shifted into what I'd come to recognize as her protective mode. She descended from her porch with purpose, crossing into my yard as if she had every right to investigate this new development. "Well, isn't that nice of him?" she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced nice was the right word. Mike, to his credit, seemed completely unfazed by Carol's scrutiny. He climbed down from the ladder, wiped his hands on his work pants, and extended one toward her with the same genuine smile he'd given me. "Mike Rodriguez," he said simply. "I've been doing some work around the neighborhood. Your flower beds look fantastic, by the way. That's some serious green thumb work." The compliment about her flowers was exactly the right thing to say. Carol's suspicious expression melted into pleased surprise, and I watched her posture shift from protective interrogation to neighborly interest. It was a small moment, but it told me something important about Mike's character. He paid attention to details, understood people, and knew how to make them feel valued. "Oh, well, thank you," Carol said, actually blushing slightly. "I've been working on that corner bed for 3 seasons now. The soil was terrible when we moved in." She launched into a detailed explanation of her gardening techniques, while Mike listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about plant varieties and seasonal care. Watching this interaction, I felt something stir inside me that I hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't just attraction, though Mike was certainly appealing in his quiet, competent way. It was something deeper, a recognition of kindness and authenticity that felt increasingly rare. Here was someone who took the time to see people, who found ways to make them feel important, even in casual encounters. As a teacher, I'd spent years trying to instill those same qualities in my students. and seeing them demonstrated so naturally was both refreshing and deeply attractive. When Mike returned to his work on the gutters, Carol lingered in my yard, ostensibly admiring the progress but clearly reluctant to miss whatever might happen next. I found myself torn between appreciation for her protective instincts and a desire for privacy to process what I was feeling. The morning that had started as a simple home maintenance task was evolving into something far more complex, and I wasn't sure I was ready for the emotional territory we seemed to be entering. As Mike worked his way around to the back of the house, I followed along below, ostensibly to spot for safety, but really because I didn't want our conversation to end. There was something about his presence that made the house feel less empty, less like a monument to a failed marriage and more like a home with possibilities. For the first time in months, I found myself thinking about the future not as something to endure, but as something that might hold unexpected surprises. The gutters turned out to be more than just a cleaning job. As Mike worked his way around the house, he discovered a section near the back corner where water had been pooling, causing the fascia board to rot slightly. It wasn't an emergency, but it would need attention before winter set in with full force. Standing below while he examined the damage, I found myself studying the way he approached problems with calm assessment rather than alarm. "It's fixable," he said, climbing down to show me a small piece of the damaged wood. "Probably happened gradually over a couple of seasons. The good news is we caught it before it became a bigger issue." He had this way of explaining things that didn't make me feel stupid for not noticing the problem myself, which I appreciated more than he probably realized. We walked around to the front yard where his tools were spread out on a tarp, and I offered to make coffee while he gathered what he'd need for a temporary repair. The invitation felt natural, the kind of neighborly gesture that had been missing from my life since the divorce. Brian and I had rarely entertained, and my social circle had shrunk considerably when I retired. Most of my teacher friends were still working, caught up in the demanding rhythm of lesson plans and parent conferences that had once defined my own days. Mike accepted the coffee offer with obvious pleasure, mentioning that he'd been up since 5 working on a kitchen renovation. Across town, as I prepared the coffee in my kitchen, I caught glimpses of him through the window, methodically organizing his tools and examining the damaged section more closely. There was something deeply satisfying about watching someone work with such focused attention, treating even a small repair job with professional care. When I brought the coffee outside, along with some leftover banana bread I'd made earlier in the week, Mike was sitting on my front steps reviewing something on his phone. He looked up with that same easy smile that had put me at ease from the beginning, accepting the coffee mug with hands that showed the honest wear of physical work. We settled into a comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping coffee and watching the neighborhood wake up around us. The autumn morning was one of those perfect Oregon days when the air feels crisp but not cold, when the light filtering through the changing leaves creates a golden warmth that makes everything look like a painting. I found myself noticing details I'd overlooked during my daily routines. The way Mrs. Patterson across the street had arranged pumpkins on her front porch, the sound of children playing in the distance, the gentle rustling of leaves that would soon need raking. "You've lived here long?" Mike asked, breaking the peaceful quiet with the kind of question that invited real conversation rather than small talk. I told him about moving into the house 15 years earlier, about watching the neighborhood change as young families moved in and older residents relocated to retirement communities. I found myself sharing more than I'd intended about the adjustment, of living alone, about how spaces that had once felt cozy now sometimes felt too big and too quiet. It wasn't something I'd articulated even to myself before, this sense of displacement in my own home. Mike listened with the kind of attention that made it clear he was actually hearing what I said, rather than just waiting for his turn to speak. When I mentioned my recent retirement, he asked thoughtful questions about what I'd taught and whether I missed the classroom. His curiosity seemed genuine, unmarked by the polite disinterest that often greeted discussions of education in social settings. "English literature," I explained. 30 years of trying to convince teenagers that Shakespeare was writing about emotions they understood, even if the language felt foreign. I found myself laughing as I remembered some of the more creative interpretations my students had offered over the years, the way they'd sometimes surprised me with insights I hadn't considered. Mike's eyes lit up with interest. I bet you have some stories. I wasn't much of a student myself, but I had a couple of teachers who made all the difference. They saw something in me when I couldn't see it myself. There was a note of respect in his voice that teachers rarely hear, a recognition of the impact the profession can have beyond test scores and graduation rates. As we talked, other neighbors began to emerge for their Saturday morning routines. Frank, the retired widower from 2 houses down, walked by with his ancient golden retriever, stopping to chat about the weather and compliment Mike's work on the gutters. Emma, the college student who rented the apartment above the garage at the end of the block, jogged past with headphones in, waving cheerfully when she spotted us. There was something magical about these casual encounters, the way they wove together to create the fabric of neighborhood life. I realized I'd been missing this sense of connection, the informal interactions that had once been part of my daily routine when I was rushing off to school each morning. Retirement had brought freedom from schedules and deadlines, but it had also removed me from the natural social rhythms that had structured my adult life. Carol reappeared periodically, finding excuses to water plants or check her mailbox while keeping an eye on our extended coffee break. Her protective instincts were endearing, though I could sense her curiosity building with each pass by my front yard. When Mike's phone rang with a call from his next client, I felt an unexpected disappointment that our morning was coming to an end. While he took the call, I found myself studying his profile, noting the way he listened carefully and asked clarifying questions about the job he'd be heading to next. He had the phone manner of someone who took customer service seriously, who understood that home repairs weren't just about fixing broken things, but about helping people maintain their sanctuaries. After he hung up, Mike gathered his tools with efficient movements that spoke of years of practice. The temporary repair he'd made to my fascia board looked professional and neat, better than anything I could have managed on my own. As he loaded his equipment into the truck, I felt the familiar weight of solitude settling back around me, the prospect of spending the rest of Saturday alone with my books and my thoughts. "What do I owe you for today?" I asked, reaching for my purse, though I had no idea what gutter cleaning and emergency repairs typically cost. Mike waved off the question with a smile that suggested money hadn't been his primary motivation for stopping to help. "Nothing for today," he said firmly. "Neighbor helping neighbor. But that fascia board is going to need proper attention before the weather turns bad. I could come back next weekend if you'd like, maybe Saturday morning again?" The offer hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility that extended beyond home maintenance. I found myself nodding before I'd fully processed what I was agreeing to, some instinct overriding the cautious voice that usually governed my decisions about letting people into my life. "That would be wonderful," I heard myself saying. "Same time?" Mike's smile broadened, and I caught something in his expression that made my heart skip in a way it hadn't in years. "Looking forward to it," he said simply, climbing into his truck with movements that seemed reluctant to leave. As he drove away, I stood in my driveway holding an empty coffee mug, processing what had just happened. The morning that had started as a simple home maintenance task had evolved into something unexpected, something that felt like the beginning of a story rather than just another Saturday getting through my retirement checklist. Carol materialized beside me with the stealth of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "He seems nice," she said in the carefully neutral tone she used when she was fishing for information while trying not to appear nosy. "He does," I agreed, unwilling to elaborate on feelings I was still trying to understand myself. Carol studied my face with the sharp attention of someone who'd raised 3 daughters and taught kindergarten for 25 years before retiring. "Just be careful, honey," she said finally, her voice gentler than usual. You've been through enough heartbreak. Make sure this one deserves your trust." Her words stayed with me as I cleaned up the coffee mugs and banana breadcrumbs as I stood at my kitchen window looking out at the gutters that now functioned properly thanks to Mike's help. Carol's concern came from a place of love, I knew, but it also highlighted the vulnerability I'd been trying to ignore. At 52, starting over felt both thrilling and terrifying, full of possibilities, but also fraught with the potential for disappointment. The house felt different for the rest of the day, charged with anticipation that made my usual Saturday routines feel inadequate. I found myself moving restlessly from room to room, unable to settle into my normal pattern of reading and puttering around the garden. The silence that had become my constant companion now felt less peaceful and more like waiting, as if the house itself was holding its breath for whatever came next. The week between Mike's visits crawled by with an anticipation I hadn't felt since high school. I found myself checking my appearance in mirrors more frequently, wondering what he'd think of the painting smock I wore while working in my garden, or the reading glasses perched on my nose when I got lost in a novel. These small vanities embarrassed me, but I couldn't seem to stop myself from caring about his opinion in ways that felt both foolish and wonderful. Wednesday brought an unexpected phone call that changed everything. I was grading some freelance editing work when my phone rang, the caller ID showing a number I didn't recognize. Mike's voice on the other end sent an unexpected flutter through my chest, though his tone carried a tension that immediately put me on alert. "Sarah, I hope I'm not bothering you, but I wanted to give you a heads up about something." He paused, and I could hear the sound of traffic in the background, as if he was calling from his truck between jobs. I was working on the Henderson place today, and I overheard Carol talking to Mrs. Henderson about some concerns she has, about me specifically. My heart sank. Carol's protective instincts had apparently shifted into overdrive during the days since Mike's visit. I could picture her making the rounds through the neighborhood, sharing her observations and concerns with the careful precision of someone who genuinely believed she was protecting people she cared about. "What kind of concerns?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Carol had been widowed for 8 years, and her experiences with men who'd tried to take advantage of her vulnerability had made her suspicious of any male attention directed toward the women in our neighborhood. Mike's sigh was audible through the phone. "Apparently she's been asking around about me, checking references, that sort of thing, which I understand, I really do. But she's also been telling people that you might be, I don't know how to put this delicately, that you might be an easy target because of your divorce and retirement." The words stung more than they should have. Being characterized as vulnerable felt like a reduction of everything I'd worked to rebuild about myself over the past 3 years. I'd fought hard to establish my independence, to prove to myself and others that I could manage alone. The idea that people saw me as fragile or naive felt like a betrayal of that progress. "I'm sorry she's putting you in this position," I said, meaning it sincerely. "Carol means well, but she sometimes oversteps boundaries when she thinks someone needs protecting. The thing is," Mike continued, his voice careful, "some of what she found out might actually concern you too. She discovered that I went through a pretty messy divorce myself about 2 years ago. My ex-wife made some allegations during the proceedings that weren't true, but they're still out there in public records if someone knows where to look. My teaching background had given me experience with gossip and half-truths, with the way information could be twisted and reshaped as it passed from person to person. I'd seen good people destroyed by rumors and assumptions, had watched as isolated. Facts were woven into narratives that bore little resemblance to reality, but I'd also learned to trust my instincts about people, and everything about Mike's character felt genuine. "What kind of allegations?" I asked, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. Part of me wanted to hang up the phone, to retreat, back into the safety of my solitary life where complications like this couldn't touch me. But a stronger part was curious about how he would handle this conversation, whether he would try to minimize or deflect, or whether he would meet the situation with the same straightforward honesty he'd shown in everything else. Mike was quiet, for a long moment before answering. She accused me of being controlling and financially manipulative, said I'd isolated her from her friends and family, managed all the money, that sort of thing. None of it was true, but by the time the lawyers got involved, the narrative had taken on a life of its own. I could hear the pain in his voice, the way those false accusations had clearly left wounds that hadn't fully healed. Having gone through my own divorce, I understood how the process could distort reality, how fear and anger could transform shared memories into weapons designed to inflict maximum damage. The truth was actually the opposite, he continued. Jennifer was the one who controlled everything. Where we lived, how we spent money, who we socialized with. I worked constantly to try to keep up with her expectations, took on extra jobs, to pay for the lifestyle she wanted. When I finally said I couldn't do it anymore, that we needed to find a more sustainable way to live, that's when everything fell apart. His story resonated with my own experience in ways that were both comforting and concerning. Brian had been controlling too, though in subtler ways that had taken me years to recognize. The constant criticism disguised as helpfulness, the way my opinions had gradually mattered less in our shared decisions, the slow erosion of my confidence in my own judgment. By the time I'd found the courage to leave, I'd almost forgotten who I was outside of his expectations. I understand why Carol is worried, Mike said. If I were in her position, hearing that story without context, I'd probably be concerned too. I just wanted you to know before Saturday, in case she talks to you about it. The conversation left me unsettled in ways that extended beyond the immediate situation. Carol's investigation felt invasive, a violation of the trust I'd placed in her friendship over the years. But it also forced me to confront questions I'd been avoiding about my own motivations and vulnerabilities. Was I drawn to Mike because of genuine compatibility? Or was I simply lonely enough to overlook potential red flags? That evening, Carol appeared at my front door with a casserole and an expression that meant business. I invited her in reluctantly, knowing that avoidance would only make the conversation more difficult when it inevitably happened. She settled into my living room with the determined air of someone preparing to deliver unwelcome but necessary information. I've been doing some research, she began without preamble, confirming what Mike had already told me. About your handyman. Friend, there are some things you should know before you get too involved. I listened as she laid out her findings with the thoroughness of a prosecutor presenting evidence. Court documents, public records, even a conversation she'd had with someone who claimed to know Jennifer's side of the story. It was an impressive investigation, and I could see the genuine concern behind her efforts, even as I felt frustrated by her presumption that I couldn't handle these discoveries myself. I appreciate your concern, I said when she finished, but I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about who I spend time with. Carol's expression softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. Sarah, honey, you've been through so much already. I just don't want to see you get hurt again by someone who might not be what he seems. Her words echoed my own fears, the voice of caution that had been whispering warnings since the moment I'd felt attracted to Mike. But they also triggered a surge of defiance that surprised me with its intensity. I'd spent too many years letting other people's fears limit my choices, letting Brian's criticisms convince me that my judgment couldn't be trusted. What if he is exactly what he seems? I asked. What if you're wrong about this? Carol studied my face with the sharp attention she'd once used to assess which of her kindergarten students was hiding something. Then I'll be the first to apologize, she said finally. But until we know for sure, promise me you'll be careful. After she left, I sat in my living room, surrounded by the comfortable familiarity of my retirement routine, trying to process the competing emotions churning inside me. The logical part of my mind acknowledged that Carol's concerns weren't unreasonable, that protecting myself from potential heartbreak was a valid priority. but another part, a part that had been dormant for too long, refused to let fear make my decisions. I thought about the way Mike had handled our phone conversation, the way he'd volunteered difficult information rather than hoping I wouldn't find out. I remembered the kindness he'd shown to Carol despite knowing she was investigating him, the respect he'd shown for my intelligence by trusting me with the truth. These weren't the actions of someone trying to manipulate or deceive. Friday evening brought another surprise in the form of Emma, the college student from down the block, appearing at my door with a bottle of wine and an apologetic smile. I'd always liked Emma's directness, the way she approached the world with curiosity rather than suspicion, and I was genuinely pleased to see her. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, "but I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that there's been some drama involving you and the cute handyman, and I thought you might want a friendly ear." Over wine and leftover Chinese takeout, Emma provided a refreshing perspective on the situation. As someone in her early 20s who'd grown up with social media and online dating, she had a more nuanced understanding of how information could be manipulated and how past relationships could be weaponized during divorces. "The thing is," she said, curling up in my armchair with the casual comfort of someone who'd never learned to doubt her own judgment, "people lie all the time during divorces. Like, all the time. My parents went through this awful split when I was in high school, and the things they said about each other during the proceedings were completely different from the people I'd lived with my whole life." Her perspective was both reassuring and challenging, forcing me to consider whether I was letting Carol's fears override my own instincts. Emma had met Mike briefly during one of her morning jogs, and her assessment was uncompromised by protective concern or personal history with divorce trauma. "He seems genuine," she said simply. "But more than that, he seems to see you as an actual person, not just someone to project his own stuff onto. That's rarer than you might think, especially for guys his age." As Saturday morning approached, I found myself caught between anticipation and anxiety, excited about seeing Mike again, but uncertain about how to navigate the complications Carol's investigation had introduced. I'd always prided myself on being straightforward in my relationships, but this situation required a delicacy I wasn't sure I possessed. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of Oregon weather that made everything feel muted and uncertain. I'd been awake since 5, nursing coffee and second-guessing every decision I'd made over the past week. When Mike's truck pulled into my driveway at exactly 9 o'clock, my heart did that same skip it had done the previous weekend, despite all the complications that had emerged in between. He climbed out of his truck with his usual easy confidence, but I could see tension in his shoulders as he gathered his tools. The conversation we'd had earlier in the week hung between us like a storm cloud, acknowledged but not yet resolved. When he knocked on my front door, his smile was genuine but careful, as if he wasn't sure what kind of reception to expect. "Morning," he said simply, his eyes searching my face for clues about where we stood. "Ready to tackle that fascia board?" I invited him in for coffee, needing to address the elephant in the room before we could pretend everything was normal. My kitchen suddenly felt too small with both of us in it, the intimacy of the space highlighting how much had changed since our easy conversation the previous weekend. Mike accepted the coffee mug with hands that I noticed were slightly unsteady, and I realized he was more nervous about this conversation than he'd let on during our phone call. "We should probably talk about what Carol discovered," I said, diving straight into the deep end rather than prolonging the awkwardness with small talk. Mike nodded, relief flickering across his features at my directness. "I'm glad you brought it up," he said, settling against my kitchen counter with the kind of careful distance that suggested he didn't want to crowd me while we navigated this conversation. "I've been thinking all week about how to explain everything without sounding like I'm making excuses." What followed was the most honest conversation I'd had with anyone in months. Mike told me about his marriage to Jennifer, about the gradual realization that he'd become a different person in trying to meet her expectations. He described the isolation that had crept in so slowly he'd barely noticed it happening. The way his own friends and interests had been systematically discouraged until his world had shrunk to just work and home. The irony is that she accused me of doing to her exactly what she'd been doing to me, he said, staring into his coffee cup as if the answers to life's complexities might be floating there. By the time I understood what was happening, I'd lost track of who I was outside of that relationship. His story resonated with my own experience in ways that were both comforting and unsettling. The patterns he described were familiar, the slow erosion of self that happened when you loved someone who needed you to be smaller to make them feel bigger. But hearing it from his perspective also highlighted how differently the same dynamics could be perceived and remembered. "What convinced you to leave?" I asked, curious about the moment of clarity that had given him the courage to end his marriage. In my own case, it had taken years of small revelations before I'd finally accepted that Brian and I weren't going to find our way back to happiness. Mike was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that made my chest tight. I realized I was becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone who apologized for existing instead of living. One morning I woke up and couldn't remember the last time I'd made a decision about anything important. That's when I knew I had to choose between saving the marriage and saving myself. The conversation shifted something fundamental between us. The careful politeness that had characterized our interactions gave way to a deeper honesty that felt both risky and necessary. I found myself sharing details about my own divorce that I'd never voiced to anyone, about the shame I'd felt in admitting that 30 years of marriage had been built on foundations that couldn't support the weight of real intimacy. The hardest part, I confessed, was realizing how long I'd been pretending everything was fine. Not just to other people, but to myself. When I finally told Brian I wanted a divorce, he seemed genuinely shocked, as if he'd had no idea I was unhappy. Mike nodded with the recognition of someone who'd lived through similar revelations. Jennifer was the same way. In her mind, everything was perfect because I'd stopped expressing any needs or opinions that conflicted with hers. She thought my compliance meant contentment. By the time we moved outside to work on the damaged fascia board, something had shifted between us. The weight of unspoken complications had been acknowledged and examined, and while it hadn't disappeared entirely, it no longer felt like an insurmountable barrier to connection. We worked together with an ease that felt earned rather than assumed, Mike explaining each step of the repair process while I held tools and asked questions. The damage section was more extensive than we'd initially realized, requiring Mike to remove and replace a longer piece of wood than he'd originally planned. What should have been a quick fix turned into a more involved project, but neither of us seemed in a hurry to finish. There was something satisfying about working together on a concrete problem with a clear solution, a welcome contrast to the emotional complexity we'd been navigating. Around noon, Carol appeared in my backyard with the timing of someone who'd been watching for the right moment. She carried a plate of sandwiches and wore the expression of someone who'd spent the morning rehearsing a difficult conversation. Mike and I exchanged glances that were equal parts amusement and resignation. "I thought you might be getting hungry," Carol said, though her attention was clearly focused on assessing the dynamic between Mike and me. She studied our easy collaboration with the sharp eyes of someone looking for evidence to support or refute her concerns. To my surprise, Mike set down his tools and addressed Carol directly. "I understand you've been asking around about me," he said with a calm directness that caught both Carol and me off guard. "I appreciate that you're looking out for Sarah. That shows the kind of friend and neighbor she's lucky to have." Carol's prepared confrontation seemed to deflate slightly in the face of Mike's straightforward acknowledgement. She'd clearly been expecting defensiveness or deflection, not gratitude for her protective instincts. "I just think people should know what they're getting into," she said, though her tone was less certain than usual. "You're absolutely right," Mike agreed. "Sarah deserves to know everything about my past, including the parts that don't reflect well on my judgment. I'd rather she hear it directly from me than piece it together from public records and secondhand stories." What followed was a conversation I never could have imagined when I woke up that morning. Mike, Carol, and I sat on my back patio eating sandwiches while he answered her questions with a patience and honesty that gradually wore down her resistance. He didn't minimize his mistakes or paint himself as a victim, instead acknowledging the ways he'd contributed to the problems in his marriage while also standing firm about the allegations that weren't true. Carol's interrogation was thorough, but fair, and I watched Mike respond to each question without defensiveness or evasion. When she asked about his financial situation, he pulled out his phone and showed her his business license and insurance information. When she pressed him about his long-term intentions, he admitted he didn't know where any of this was leading, but that he cared enough about my well-being to want whatever developed between us to be built on truth rather than assumptions. "I've made enough mistakes in relationships to know that trust has to be earned," he said, looking directly at Carol while somehow including me in the conversation. "I'm not asking anyone to take my word for anything. I'm asking for the chance to prove myself through my actions." By the time Carol left, promising to bring dessert later that evening, the tension that had defined the morning had transformed into something more hopeful. Mike and I finished the repair work in comfortable silence, both of us processing what had just happened. The fascia board looked professional and solid, but more importantly, something between us had been repaired as well. As Mike packed up his tools, the question that had been building inside me all week finally found its voice. The words came out in a rush, before I could lose my nerve or talk myself out of taking the risk. "I'm 52, I said, my heart pounding, so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Will you give me your number? Just curious." Mike's hand stilled on the tool he'd been putting away. He looked up at me with an expression that was part surprise, part delight, and completely honest. The smile that spread across his face felt like sunrise after a long night, warm and full of possibility. "Sarah," he said softly, "I thought you'd never ask." He pulled out his phone and handed it to me, watching as I entered my contact information, with fingers that trembled slightly. When I handed it back, our fingers brushed in a moment of connection that felt charged with potential. The simple exchange of phone numbers suddenly felt monumental, like crossing a bridge I'd been afraid to step onto. "So what happens now?" I asked, feeling simultaneously bold and terrified by my own question. Mike's smile widened as he climbed into his truck. "Now we find out what happens when two people decide to stop letting the past write their future," he said. "I'll call you tonight, if that's okay." As he drove away, I stood in my driveway holding my phone and feeling like I'd just jumped off a cliff. The safety of my careful, controlled retirement suddenly felt less appealing than the uncertain territory that stretched ahead. For the first time in years, I had no idea what came next, and that felt like the most hopeful thing of all. The phone call came that evening as promised, right as I was debating whether to pretend I wasn't home if it actually rang. Mike's voice sounded different over the phone, more intimate somehow, as if the technology had stripped away the careful distance we'd been maintaining and left only the genuine connection underneath. "I keep thinking about what you said today," he began, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "About being curious. I'm curious too, about a lot of things where you're concerned." What followed was a conversation that stretched past midnight, covering everything from childhood memories to dreams we'd abandoned and picked up again. Mike told me about his plan to expand his handyman business into a full renovation company, about the old Victorian house he'd been slowly restoring as his own project. I shared my secret desire to write the novel I'd been outlining in my head for years, built around the stories my students had told me over 3 decades of teaching. The conversation meandered through territories I hadn't explored with anyone in years. We talked about favorite books, worst cooking disasters, the songs that made us cry, and the places we'd always wanted to travel but never had the courage to visit. Mike confessed he'd never been on an airplane, that his entire world had been contained within a 100-mile radius of where he grew up. I admitted that despite teaching literature for 30 years, I'd never read Moby Dick because the first chapter had always put me to sleep. These small revelations felt monumental in their intimacy, like trading secrets that mattered precisely because they were ordinary. I found myself laughing at his story about accidentally dyeing his white laundry pink during his first week of living alone after the divorce, and he listened with genuine interest as I described the elaborate schemes I'd devised to make Shakespeare relevant to teenagers who thought everything written before 1990 was ancient history. Over the following weeks, our relationship developed with the steady progression of adults who'd learned not to rush toward heartbreak. Mike would text me good morning messages that made my coffee taste better, and I'd find myself taking pictures of beautiful clouds or interesting flowers to send him throughout the day. We started having dinner together once a week, alternating between cooking at my house and trying new restaurants in town. The shift in neighborhood dynamics was subtle, but unmistakable. Carol's suspicion gradually transformed into protective approval as she watched Mike prove himself through consistent kindness and reliability. When my kitchen faucet started leaking, he appeared with tools and expertise, refusing payment but accepting my offer of homemade lasagna. When his truck broke down outside my house during a particularly heavy rainstorm, I drove him to his next appointment without being asked. Emma became our unlikely champion, delighting in what she called the most romantic meet-cute in neighborhood history. She started dropping by more frequently, ostensibly to borrow books, but really to check on the progress of our relationship with the invested enthusiasm of someone watching her favorite romantic comedy unfold in real life. Her visits became a source of gentle humor for Mike and me, as we learned to recognize the signs of her approach and would exchange amused glances when she knocked on the door with increasingly transparent excuses. Frank, the elderly widower from down the street, surprised everyone by taking Mike under his wing as a sort of informal neighborhood mentor. Frank had been the unofficial historian of Maple Street for the past 15 years, and he seemed to recognize in Mike someone who might carry on the tradition of caring about community connections. They'd spend Sunday afternoons working on Frank's ancient Buick, while Frank shared stories about the neighborhood's evolution and the families who'd shaped its character. The first real test came 6 weeks after that Saturday morning when I asked for his number. Mike had been quiet for a few days, responding to my texts but without his usual warmth, and I'd started wondering if I'd done something wrong. The old voices of self-doubt that I'd worked so hard to silence began whispering familiar refrains about being too old, too boring, too set in my ways for someone to genuinely want to build a future with. When he finally called and asked if he could come over to talk, my stomach dropped with the familiar dread of impending disappointment. I'd been down this road before, had experienced the slow fade that preceded the inevitable conversation about how wonderful I was, but how the timing wasn't right, or the chemistry wasn't quite there. I prepared myself for gentle rejection while hoping desperately that I was wrong. He arrived at my door looking exhausted, carrying a manila envelope that he set on my kitchen table with the careful handling of something potentially explosive. "Jennifer contacted me yesterday," he said without preamble. "She wants to meet to discuss unfinished business from our divorce." My first instinct was to retreat, to protect myself from whatever drama was about to unfold. But looking at Mike's face, seeing the genuine distress there, I realized this was exactly the kind of moment that would define what we were building together. I could choose fear and self-preservation, or I could choose trust and partnership. The decision felt like standing at a crossroads where one path led back to the safety of solitude, and the other led into uncertain territory that might hold either heartbreak or happiness. "What kind of unfinished business?" I asked, settling into the chair across from him, and noting how his shoulders relaxed slightly at my calm response. The envelope contained legal documents related to property they'd owned together, a rental house that had been tied up in litigation since their divorce. Jennifer was finally ready to sell, but the process required Mike's cooperation and signature. What should have been a straightforward business transaction was complicated by her insistence on handling everything face-to-face, rather than through lawyers. Part of me wonders if this is really about the house, Mike admitted, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I'd come to recognize as his way of processing stress. The timing feels suspicious, like maybe she's heard I'm seeing someone and wants to complicate things. We spent the evening strategizing how to handle the situation, and I was surprised by how natural it felt to be included in this kind of problem-solving. Mike listened to my suggestions with the respect of someone who valued my opinion, and I found myself offering advice with the confidence of someone whose judgment was trusted. We discussed everything from the legal implications to the emotional dynamics, and I drew on my years of dealing with difficult parents and administrative politics to help him think through potential scenarios. The conversation revealed layers of Mike's character that I hadn't seen before. His ex-wife's reappearance had clearly triggered old anxieties about his worth and judgment, but he was handling the stress with a maturity that impressed me. He didn't minimize the potential complications or pretend the situation didn't affect him, but he also didn't let his emotions drive his decision-making process. The meeting with Jennifer took place the following Tuesday at a coffee shop downtown. Mike had asked if I wanted to come for moral support, and after much deliberation, I decided to wait in my car across the street. The decision felt like a delicate balance between showing support and maintaining appropriate boundaries. I couldn't see much through the cafe windows, but I could observe body language and timing. Could be there if he needed backup without inserting myself into a conversation. That wasn't mine to join. What I witnessed over the course of an hour was Mike handling a clearly difficult situation with grace and firmness. When Jennifer's animated gestures suggested she was trying to engage him in more than business conversation, he remained seated and calm. When she appeared to be crying at one point, he handed her napkins but didn't move closer or offer comfort beyond basic human decency. I watched him maintain professional distance while still treating her with respect, and I felt my admiration for him deepen. The legal documents were signed, hands were shaken rather than hugged, and Mike walked out of that coffee shop looking like someone who'd successfully closed a chapter of his life. When he got into my car, he was quiet for a long moment before turning to me with an expression of profound relief. "She offered to try again," he said simply. "Told me she'd learned from her mistakes and thought we could work things out if I was willing to give it another chance." My heart stopped for a moment before he continued. "I told her I hoped she had learned from her mistakes, and that I had, too. One of the biggest things I learned was that some chapters are meant to stay closed, no matter how much history they contain." His words hit me with unexpected force, not just because of what they meant for our relationship, but because of the wisdom they contained about growth and letting go. I'd spent years clinging to the familiar pain of my failed marriage, afraid that moving forward meant diminishing the significance of what I'd lost. Mike's clarity about his past gave me permission to stop apologizing for my own journey toward happiness. 3 months later, Mike and I were inseparable in the way that happens when two people discover they genuinely enjoy each other's company. We'd developed routines and inside jokes, had survived our first disagreement about whether my guest bathroom needed repainting, and had emerged stronger for having worked through it together. The argument had been minor, but it had revealed important things about how we each handled conflict and compromise. The neighborhood had fully embraced our relationship by then. Carol had started inviting Mike to her monthly dinner parties, where he charmed her friends with his easy humor and genuine interest in their stories. Emma had appointed herself the unofficial photographer of our relationship, capturing candid moments when she thought we weren't paying attention. Her Instagram account became a documentation of neighborhood life, with Mike and me appearing as recurring characters in her ongoing narrative about community and connection. Frank, the retired teacher down the street, had become Mike's unofficial mentor in neighborhood politics, teaching him the subtle art of homeowner association diplomacy. Their friendship had blossomed into something that benefited both men, giving Frank someone to share his knowledge with, and providing Mike with insights into the complex social dynamics that governed small community life. When Mike suggested, We take a weekend trip to the coast. I realized I was ready for the next step in our relationship. Not rushing toward anything permanent, but acknowledging that what we'd built was solid enough to support new adventures. We booked a bed and breakfast in Cannon Beach, planning to spend our days walking the shoreline and our evenings talking about everything and nothing. The night before we left, I found myself standing in my bedroom looking at the suitcase I'd packed, marveling at how much my life had changed since that ordinary Saturday morning when I'd decided to clean my gutters. The woman who'd been afraid to ask a stranger for help with home maintenance had somehow found the courage to ask for his phone number, to trust him with her heart, to believe that 52 wasn't too late for new beginnings. Mike picked me up early Saturday morning, his truck loaded with camping chairs and a cooler full of snacks, looking like someone embarking on the adventure of a lifetime. As we drove toward the coast, windows down and music playing, I felt the last of my reservations dissolve into the Oregon sunshine. The landscape rolling past our windows seemed to mirror the transformation happening inside me. Familiar territory giving way to new vistas and unexpected beauty. "I have something to tell you," I said as we reached the highway, feeling brave enough to voice the words that had been building inside me for weeks. Mike glanced over at me, eyebrows raised in curiosity. "Should I be worried?" "I'm falling in love with you," I said simply, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating as they left my mouth. "Just thought you should know." Mike's smile could have powered the entire coastal highway. He reached over and took my hand, threading our fingers together with the careful reverence of someone handling something precious. "Sarah," he said, his voice warm with affection and promise. "I fell in love with you the moment you asked if you were beautiful at 51. Not because of the question, but because of the courage it took to ask it." As we drove toward the ocean, toward whatever came next, I understood that beauty had nothing to do with age or appearance, and everything to do with the willingness to remain open to love, to growth, to the possibility that the best chapters of our lives might still be waiting to be written. The road ahead stretched endlessly before us, full of potential and promise, and for the first time in years, I couldn't wait to see what adventures awaited around the next bend. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.